Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, everybody, and also in the framework of the Horizon 2020 Marie Curie Fellowship, to thank the EU as a Brit and as as there are several UK-based non-Brit scholars here as well, for how much longer we are able to thank the EU in an official capacity, and also as this is on record, to officially state this. And so today I will be discussing almost entirely Coptic texts from the 8th century from the village Djeme, built in and around the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, Medinet Harbour on the west bank of Thebes. Some old early 20th century and modern shots on screen. In the framework of the meeting, in this, the subtitle Individual Histories, the vast wealth of Coptic documentary material, and Lajos has already mentioned the number of legal documents on Western Thebes, we have this great opportunity to examine individual histories in very many different walks of life. Family histories follow individual people, but I've been particularly interested in, for a number of years, is individual scribes. And individual scribes, we are able to identify many by name from the region and from Djeme. Not only on one hand do they record the individual histories of people in the region, but through examination of their dossiers, the documents that they wrote, we're also able to trace the individual histories of scribes. And this has been my particular interest, and not just from a micro-social, economic or social history from the region, but also by looking at individual scribes and how they change over time, how this may indeed reflect changes happening across Marinid Egypt, particularly Marinid Egypt, for evidence being the first half of the 8th century in this case. And as a cheap and shameless plug for my work on the best attested scribe of legal documents, Aristophanes, son of Johannes, whom Lajos mentioned earlier, this is the individual to whom I've spent most of my time in recent years, and I want to show him here just really to form a contrast for what I'll be talking about for the rest of the paper, but also to show the kind of evidence that we have for scribes and what we can trace. So with Aristophanes, we're very fortunate in that a number of his documents are absolutely dated by means of Diocletian and also Hedron. The earliest text that we have is Tagion, the tax demand from 724. In the latter half of the 720s, we have over 100 tax receipts that he wrote and signed. And then from the 730s up until 756, when we have two texts that are dated absolutely, we have 23 legal documents, contracts of various guises, deeds that he wrote. And so we can trace his career, as it will, moving from these different spheres of text production, from tax amendments, again, continuing this case of what's public and private and legal and not, moving from his earliest attestations as an administrative scribe, writing almost entirely administrative documents, to a scribe within the village, writing almost entirely private documents for individuals in the town. And this framework I just want to outline not only as a cheap plug for my own book, which comes out November the 2nd with the University of Michigan Press, but in order to place him in contrast with the main scribe that I will be talking about today. And this is one of his predecessors at the village, Pasates, son of Pisrel. And so what I will do initially in the first instance is to present the documents that he wrote in chronological order, and then to discuss how he fits within what is happening at Thebes, and maybe within wider systems in place locally and regionally and nationally. And so, as his tour through his documents take us, his first documents we can date is PCLT 1 on screen in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is a legal document concerning a large sum of money that the monk Moses, whose son Theodore is also in the monastery, of Upper Paul, which, depending on who you speak to working on the mission at Deir Bakit, is either absolutely the monastery at Deir Bakit or is possibly the monastery at Deir Bakit, but a photograph of Deir Bakit anyway. And after following a time of plague, Moses donates 20 gold coins, whether we call them solidai, monosma, holocaustos, whatever we want, dinars. Donates this large sum of money, then requests some of it back, and for himself, and then for his son, and then also ends up giving it back to the monastery as well. This document, see the protocol at the beginning, which references the governor, Abdulaziz ibn Marwan, and we can date this on this basis, plus the internal dating criteria to 698. Excuse me, one of my interests me is obviously the identification of the scribes, and then we have the scribal notation. So I, Psate, the son of the late Pisrel, Moses, the most humble monk, asked me, and I wrote this document in Egyptian by my hand. And so the language, just to stress, it's in Coptic, quite a long notation at the end of the document. The next text that we have is also written in association with the monastery of Upper Paul, PCLT 5, this in the British Library. And this records a dispute between the monasteries of Upper Paul and Upper Fordman at Battery, seemingly over money found by one of the monk. And it also, in terms of documents and the power of legal documents, it's very interesting, talks about scraps of documents, documents being torn up, previous documents being invalid, despite being witnessed, in terms of then this, on a side note, but as we've been talking about documents in general the past day and a half, a lot of the legal documents refer to the validity of current documents and the lack of validity of previous ones should they try to be used in a court of law against the current owners. So we can build up this history of the power and use of documents. But that's really a side point to, again, looking at the signature. And this one is much longer, still in Coptic, but basically to the same purpose. I, Psate, son of Pisrel, while sitting with the parties to the document, they and the witnesses, they asked me, and I've written up this document. So a long 4-line notation at the end of the text. After this text dates 711 or 12, it has the indiction year, we have a vast body of tax receipts. From the published tax receipts, plus what I know of the unpublished tax receipts that, for example, I am working on, but also other individuals such as Nick Johannes. I think we're talking about maybe, as far as I know, about 580 to 600 tax receipts from the village. Psate wrote 200 of these. And so we have a third of all taxation documents from the village written by the scribe over quite a large period of time, 713-14 to 7245. In terms of dating, at this point, I largely direct people to Alain de Aristophanes' introduction to the tax receipts in the P. Strasbourg Copt volume in terms of dating and indiction years and our current knowledge of these matters rather than reiterate anything at this point. And the 3 documents on the 3 receipts on screen. The middle one is part of a group will appear in the next volume of Basel from Columbia's collection. The other 2 are from the Kelsey Museum, which I am preparing now for publication. In terms of language, the one in the middle is in Coptic or is bilingual. There's substantial Greek elements. The other 2 are Greek. And for now, I won't necessarily comment on the use of Greek at this point, although should people be interested, we can discuss. Sticking with signatures, we have a mixture of Coptic, so this is the longest of his signatures in the tax receipts. Psate, son of Pisrel, he asked me and I wrote this Antagion, which is the word used for receipts in this context. We have a shorter Coptic signature, Psate, son of Pisrel, I wrote this Antagion. And note this is a Coptic subscription on a Greek tax receipt. And then we also have Greek signatures, in this instance on a Greek tax receipt with no ores, Passate palaeography. Before moving on, in terms of taxation and possible connection, Passate also wrote at least three texts survive which bear his signature, these Logos Emprenoite, Word of God protection passes, which are generally associated with taxation as well. He may well have written more, but the originals would have to be checked. And all of those, by the way, have the shorter Coptic signature. Moving on after this, he continued to work in the town, but now rather than writing documents associated with the monastery as beforehand, all the remains of his documents afterwards are written for villages within Djeme, within Medinet Habu. So PKU 36 is part of a dossier, or Holy Family Archive, concerned with the family of two women, Abigail and Elizabeth. This is a family in their history that Terry Wolfong has written about in a couple of chapters in his book, Women of Djeme. In this document, just so I don't forget that, it's concerns against a settlement concerning inherited property between the aunt and niece. But for particular purposes, the scribal notation doesn't survive as well as complete the previous ones, but now we see a switch to him signing in Greek. And I will go on to what I think my thoughts about this are later. It's part of it's lost. I take largely there the editio princeps with marking actually extra damage. The next one, PKU 37, also concerning Elizabeth and her son George, her son from her first husband, and his desperate concerns for his future financial solvency and well-being, lest all of her property go to his stepdad and his half-brother and sister, and he is left out of the inheritance. And again, we have the signature in Greek, and again, the lighting I realize isn't great for faint text either, but the main point is a much shorter Greek signature. And then PKU 44, which is a arbitration between two married sisters and a settlement of property paternal inheritance. And here we have a much nicer signature, and here we have a shift from egraphe, we have egeneton, which is not a signature that a phraseology that he otherwise uses, but which is common elsewhere in Thebes, as I will demonstrate shortly. In addition to these known texts, we also have PKU 23, a deed of sale, which Sarah, son of Theophilos, sells to Paulos, son of Ananias, a third share in a house. Doesn't bear a signature, but attributed initially by Crum to Passate based on palaeography and formulae. And then we also have two shorter texts, Okram VC 8 and 9, written from the Shane, Severus and Johannes to the Brethren of Monastery of Paul. I forget why the question mark is there. I think because maybe the monastery isn't specifically stated. It could be a typo. And this is a Logos text, but rather than Word of God, it's the Word of the Holy Trinity, the Word of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And it has a year date by the addiction. Walter Till, in his De Theorum and Prosopography of Theban texts, provided dates of either 698 or 728, arguing that in terms of the Shane, the indiction cycle in the middle was impossible. However, the indiction, I think he's reading it as 12 because the 11th indiction presents no conflict to what we know elsewhere. And in fact, this could be 697 or 712, sorry, and therefore also would fit generally his chronology of working in association with the monastery in a general framework. And if we provide this overview roughly and schematically, as his early texts, PCLT 1 and 5, then the 2 Logos texts, which may be contemporary, maybe slightly later, to move to his tax receipts in the 710s, 720s, and then the legal documents that he wrote for the village in the mid-720s to late 720s exclusively. And this framework, following his career on the dates that we have, stands in opposition to Aristophanes, who starts as an administrative scribe, fully functioning writing receipts, and then moves on to private documents, and there's no association with him writing for monasteries. He writes a number of these child donation texts from the mid-750s, but they're written for private individuals with the monastery as second party. They're not written for the monastery as first party. So it's a different connection with the monastic sphere. And so whereas Aristophanes starts administrative and ends private, we have Pasate starting writing legal documents, monastic sphere, and then writes administrative texts, and then returns to private legal documents purely in the village. And I've stressed, this is one of the things that I hadn't really expected to come out of writing this paper, but also this change in how he signs documents from long Coptic subscriptions, and then in the tax receipts we see a mix of Coptic and Greek, and then after the tax receipts and legal documents he only signs in Greek. And whether this can be an influence of a switch which happens in the 20s in scribal practice, I haven't followed the chronology of the tax receipts to see if it is a definite shift that we can see there, and this is next stage to follow this systematically. But in ideas of the bigger picture, and I'll return to this, the 720s is marking a change in these administrative texts, and writing these tax receipts is the introduction of new practices and new administrative training, which I'll return to, being the prime cause, the instigator for the changes in his own personal practices. And if we go on to compare Pasate and Aristophanes, not only in terms of what they wrote and when, but in terms of how they wrote, Pasate's nicest signature on top, and then Aristophanes' notations below. His notations, apart from PKU 8, in which he runs out of space and writes witness statements in his own notation in Coptic quite quickly, every single one of his documents has a Greek notation. And they're all very standard. Djeme Aristophanes, Johannes, Egeneto. PKU 27 is longer because it mentions from the Castron Memnonian, and it's the only one of his legal texts to use Egrabsa rather than Egeneto in this. Although this I can't account for, I would call it an aberration, mainly because I don't understand why he does do what he does here. Moving from signatures to the actual body of the actual style in which they wrote, in terms of immediate aspects, the immediate overall texture and feel of the text, they write in remarkably different styles. Pasate, there are some ligatures, but it's a largely semi-ligatured, bilinear hand, however you choose to describe these, whereas Aristophanes is very cursive, changed in individual letter formations, but if we want to then follow a segmented comparison, individual words, lao, shorep, tupos, etoab, which Aristophanes becomes very sloppy in parts, the abbreviation for holokotonos, and so on. And also in this section of Aristophanes getting sloppy, these are towards the end of legal documents, and you enter pure formulae, and so they're very well practiced aspects of the text rather than bits that they have to really consciously think about. So they work as very nice comparisons. Common words and common formulae should really represent how they write most naturally, and it's really when we examine these we see a great gulf between the scribes, despite them both being in the village and having an overlap in the 720s more or less. And the question then is, how do we then account for these changes? How different and where are they receiving their training and learning to write in this style? With Aristophanes introduces this new style into Thebes. And it's my belief that this is training received outside of the village. It's not a traditional style within Western Thebes at all. The mechanisms through which he actually receives this training is much harder to, it's impossible to document. We don't have that evidence. And whether it's external training coming to the town or him going elsewhere, we can start creating fictions then about how this actually worked on the ground. For Passate, we see him working first with the monasteries and wonder if he received a much more traditional scribal training in Western Thebes. We mentioned before in questions about what evidence we have for education. And in terms of education, one text has also always struck me, and this is probably a long shot going out on a limb. So the Ostracon, the one on the left bears the opening of the Iliad, the one on the right also has the beginning of the Iliad, but in remarkably different script. These are both from the monastery of Epiphanius, and the one on the right then is also includes other types of exercise. I've always been struck not only in the different types of Greek that we see between these two examples of the Iliad, but for me when looking at the text on the left, even though it's in a thick pen and it's very little amount of Greek, that this has always struck me that have greater resemblance on kind of gut instinct and overall aspect with the style of Greek that Passate uses, and it's quite different from the style of Greek that Aristophanes uses when he writes Elements. And this is really there's too little Greek on the example of the Iliad to really compare systematically. It's really more a gut impression of associations and scribal practices. But I wonder if it can be used to anchor Passate in a much more traditional, this type of training which is happening outside of the village in the monastic sphere, and instead Aristophanes, which marks a complete and utter move away from this earlier practice, that he therefore must be receiving some kind of external or centralized training. And this is really when I'm pulling back into a bigger picture of then how the texts at Thebes, especially these administrative texts, fit into a larger practice of what's happening in Egypt in the Mahometan period. And so we have, in terms of taxation, focusing on this, whether we want to use state changes, what's happening in the country more broadly, we see the introduction of heavier taxation administration and collection in Thebes from the mid-710, 713, 14 with Passate, and it goes up to 730 with Aristophanes. About 7256, there's a shift, and there's a little intermediate period of a year, and then Aristophanes and another scribe, Syriacus and Petros, take over, and the schism is remarkable in terms of palaeography, formulae, and, well, largely those two things. And I wonder how much we can associate this with what's happening in terms of greater centralization of the taxation administrative structure within Egypt. And initially, when it's introduced to Thebes, you use scribes which are trained already, and you take them and tell them what formula to use, and you show them how it fits into the system. And Passate did this for a decade, with a small number of other scribes wrote at the same receipts at the same time, but really a very small number in both cases of individuals and ostraca. And then from the mid-720s, we see a shift in what happens, and Aristophanes comes in, who reflects much more practices that are happening on a national level. The text that Laios showed in this very administrative Greek hand is exactly the kind of Greek that we find then from Aristophanes on in Thebes. So the question is that can we link this directly to the greater centralization of the administration after the time of Abd al-Malik, and then what's happening in Thebes is a local response to this situation using local resources, individuals, and whether this is representative of what would generally be happening on a village level throughout Egypt, for which we don't have the evidence. And I think then Sate very much the scribe on the eve of change, not just in terms of broader transition in the 7th century and as big things are happening, but really within the village at a local level, that he marks a watershed in how scribes are trained and how the process is, and how the local area fits into wider, not just regional, but national systems and structures. I'd be very interested in people's thoughts on this. Thank you.